The first shot was fired as the stagecoach rounded the bend, sending Florence Blackwood diving to the dusty floor among shrieks and panicked shouts from her fellow passengers. It was 1875 in the Arizona Territory, and stage robberies were common as summer dust storms, but that didn't make the experience any less terrifying. "Everybody out. Hands where I can see 'em." The gruff voice boomed from outside as the coach lurched to a stop. Florence's heart hammered against her ribs. This journey to Silver Creek was supposed to be her fresh start, her chance to escape the pitying glances and whispered comments that had plagued her in Boston since the accident 2 years ago. Now she might not live to see her destination. The door flung open, revealing a masked man with a revolver. One by one, the passengers exited: a well-dressed businessman, an elderly couple, and a young mother clutching her infant. Florence remained frozen, her right leg throbbing with the familiar pain that always intensified when she was frightened. "You too, miss. Out." The robber gestured impatiently with his gun. Florence gripped her walking cane tightly. I need a moment." Her voice trembled nearly as much as her hands. The robber reached in, roughly grabbing her arm. "I said." A shot cracked through the air, followed by a shout. "Let the lady be." The grip on Florence's arm disappeared as the robber spun around. Another shot echoed, and the man fell backward into the dirt. "The rest of you drop your weapons or join your friend." The new voice carried authority that seemed to ripple through the air. Florence peered cautiously through the doorway. A tall figure on horseback held a rifle aimed steadily at the remaining robbers. Behind him, 2 other mounted men had their guns drawn. The bandits, suddenly outnumbered, threw down their weapons. "Miss, you can come out now. You're safe." The horseman's voice had softened, though Florence couldn't make out his features beneath the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat. Taking a deep breath, she gathered her courage and stepped onto the footboard. This was always the worst part: the moment people noticed her uneven gait, the way her right foot dragged slightly, the necessity of the cane that marked her as damaged. As she hesitated, calculating the best way to descend without embarrassing herself, a hand appeared before her. "Allow me," said the horseman, who had dismounted and approached the coach. Florence stared at the offered hand, then at the face now visible beneath the hat brim. Piercing blue eyes met hers from a sun-weathered face framed by dark hair streaked with hints of copper. He couldn't have been more than 30, with a strong jaw shadowed by stubble and a small scar that cut through his right eyebrow. "I can manage," she said stiffly, pride overriding common sense. His expression remained patient. "I'm sure you can, madam, but there's no shame in accepting help when it's offered freely." Something in his tone, lacking both pity and impatience, made Florence reconsider. She placed her hand in his, surprised by the gentleness of his grip as he helped her down. When her feet touched ground, she stumbled slightly, her bad leg buckling beneath her. His arm instantly circled her waist, steadying her with a strength that seemed effortless. "Thank you," she murmured, quickly pulling away and adjusting her stance with her cane. She felt heat rise to her cheeks, awaiting the inevitable comment about her disability. Instead, he tipped his hat. "Vaughn Harrington, madam, Sheriff of Silver Creek, Florence Blackwood." She looked up, surprised. "Silver Creek, that's my destination." A smile crossed his face, transforming his serious features. "Well then, Miss Blackwood, it seems I was meant to meet you today." While the sheriff's deputies rounded up the would-be robbers, Sheriff Harrington ensured the passengers were unharmed. The stagecoach driver had taken a bullet to the shoulder, but insisted it was merely a graze. "We'll be delayed reaching town," the driver announced after his wound was bandaged. "Got to fix that broken wheel before we can continue." Florence sighed, leaning heavily on her cane. The journey from Boston had been exhausting, and this delay only extended her discomfort. "Miss Blackwood," Sheriff Harrington approached, leading his chestnut gelding. "If you're willing, I can take you to Silver Creek myself. These men will bring the prisoners, and the coach will follow when repairs are complete." Florence hesitated. The propriety she'd been raised with balked at the idea of riding alone with a man she'd just met, sheriff or not. Yet the prospect of reaching town and a proper bed hours earlier was tempting. "I wouldn't want to inconvenience you," she said, No inconvenience at all, I was heading back anyway. His eyes, kind but direct, met hers. Unless you'd prefer to wait with the coach. Florence glanced at the damaged wheel, the tired passengers settling in the shade, and made her decision. I would appreciate the ride, Sheriff. He nodded, then looked thoughtfully at his horse. Have you ridden before, Miss Blackwood? Yes, though not since. She gestured vaguely toward her leg. The accident that had crushed her right leg beneath a carriage wheel had ended many activities she once enjoyed. Well, Rusty here is gentle as they come, Sheriff Harrington said, patting the horse's neck. I'll help you up and ride behind you if that's acceptable. Florence swallowed hard. It would mean being in close proximity to this man, this stranger, but the alternative was hours of waiting in the desert heat. Very well, she agreed. Sheriff Harrington positioned his horse beside a fallen log, which served as a mounting block. Even with this advantage, Florence struggled, her damaged leg refusing to cooperate. Before frustration could overwhelm her, strong hands circled her waist, lifting her effortlessly onto the saddle. There now, he said, climbing up behind her with practiced ease. Florence sat rigidly, acutely aware of his presence at her back. He reached around her to take the reins, his arms creating a secure bracket on either side of her. Relax, Miss Blackwood. Rusty can sense tension and he gets skittish. She made a conscious effort to release the stiffness in her shoulders. I apologize, this is unconventional, his chuckle rumbled against her back. Out here in the territory, conventional doesn't always work, we adapt. As they rode, the desert landscape stretched before them in hues of amber and rust. Florence found herself gradually relaxing into the rhythm of the horse's gait and into the solid presence behind her. May I ask what brings you to Silver Creek? Sheriff Harrington inquired after they had ridden in companionable silence for some time. My aunt passed away recently, Florence explained. She left me her home and business, a small bookshop on Main Street. I'm to take it over. Ah, you must be Harriet Miller's niece. She spoke of you often. Florence turned slightly, surprised. You knew my aunt. Everyone in Silver Creek knew Miss Harriet. She was a fixture in town, sold books to just about every child who's grown up there in the last 20 years. There was genuine warmth in his voice. I'm sorry for your loss. Thank you, Florence said softly, though I confess we weren't close. My father, her brother, had a falling out with her years ago. She wrote to me occasionally, but we hadn't seen each other since I was a child. Yet she left you everything. Florence nodded. I was as surprised as anyone. Perhaps she knew I needed a change. Sheriff Harrington didn't press for details, and Florence was grateful. She wasn't ready to explain how the accident had not only damaged her leg, but had destroyed her engagement and her standing in Boston society. How her fiancé, Edmund, had gently but firmly explained that he couldn't marry a woman who would struggle to maintain a proper household or bear healthy children. How her friends had slowly drifted away, uncomfortable with her new limitations. Silver Creek might surprise you, Sheriff Harrington said, interrupting her thoughts. It's small but growing. The silver mines bring in new folks every month, and is it civilized? Florence asked, thinking of the rugged town she'd imagined. He laughed. We have a school, 3 churches, a newspaper, and even a small theater, though I won't pretend it's Boston. The sun was beginning its descent when Silver Creek came into view, a collection of wooden buildings nestled in a valley, with mountains rising behind them. It was larger than Florence had expected, with a proper main street lined with businesses. That's your aunt's shop. Sheriff Harrington pointed to a 2-story building with a wide front porch. Living quarters are upstairs. As they approached the town, Florence became increasingly aware of the spectacle they presented, the sheriff riding double with an unknown woman. She could already feel curious eyes upon them. Perhaps you could let me down at the edge of town, she suggested. I can walk the rest of the way. Nonsense, I'll take you right to your door. His tone brooked no argument. When they reached the bookshop, Sheriff Harrington dismounted first, then turned to help Florence down. His hands were firm at her waist as she slid from the saddle, but her right leg buckled as it hit the ground. She stumbled against his chest, mortified by her clumsiness. I'm so sorry, she murmured, steadying herself with her cane. People had stopped to stare, and Florence felt the familiar shame burning her cheeks. This was precisely the attention she'd hoped to avoid. Sheriff Harrington seemed unconcerned with the onlookers. He retrieved her small traveling case from where it had been secured behind the saddle. "Mrs. Abernathy from the cafe left some food for you," he said, nodding toward the building. "The key should be under the flower pot on the porch." Florence found it exactly where he'd described and unlocked the door. The interior was dim, but tidy shelves of books lined the walls, and a counter with an ancient cash register stood at the rear. "Thank you for your assistance, Sheriff," she said formally, turning back to him. "You've been most kind." He lingered in the doorway, hat in hand. "Call me Vaughn, please, and it was my pleasure, Miss Blackwood." "Florence," she corrected automatically. "Florence," he repeated, her name sounding different in his deep voice. "Welcome to Silver Creek. I hope you'll be happy here." With that, he replaced his hat, nodded goodbye, and returned to his horse. Florence watched him ride away, puzzled by the inexplicable disappointment she felt at his departure. The next morning dawned clear and bright. Florence had spent a restless night, her leg aching from the day's unusual exertions, and her mind churning with doubts about her decision to come here. The upstairs living quarters were modest but comfortable, a bedroom, sitting room, and small kitchen, all furnished with sturdy, serviceable pieces that reflected her aunt's practical nature. After a simple breakfast, Florence ventured downstairs to examine the bookshop. Dust motes danced in the sunbeams that streamed through the windows. The shop smelled of paper, leather bindings, and the faint hint of the lavender sachet her aunt apparently kept in the drawers. Florence ran her fingers along the spines of books, some new, many used, organized in a system she would need to learn. Her aunt's ledger sat open on the counter, the last entry dated just 3 days before her death. A knock at the door startled her. Through the glass, she saw a plump woman with gray, streaked dark hair, carrying a basket. "Good morning." The woman called cheerfully when Florence opened the door. "I'm Martha Abernathy from the cafe down the street. I saw the sheriff bring you in yesterday and thought you might need some proper welcoming." "How kind of you," Florence said, stepping back to allow her entry. "I'm Florence Blackwood." "Oh, we all know who you are, dear," Martha said with a smile that suggested she meant this kindly rather than intrusively. "Harriet spoke of you often, said you had a sharp mind for books and business." Florence blinked in surprise. "She did, indeed she did. Now, I've brought you some fresh biscuits and preserves, and there's information about when we'll hold the memorial service. We waited for your arrival, of course." The realization that these strangers had postponed her aunt's funeral out of respect for her, a niece who had never visited, humbled Florence. "Thank you. I appreciate that more than I can say." Martha set her basket on the counter and looked around approvingly. "Harriet kept this place running like clockwork. It's been closed since she took ill, and folks are eager to have it open again." "I'm not sure how quickly I can manage that," Florence admitted. "I need to familiarize myself with everything first." Martha waved a hand dismissively. "No rush, dear. Take your time to settle in." Her gaze fell to Florence's cane, then quickly back to her face. "If you need any help, just ask. Silver Creek takes care of its own." After Martha left, promising to return with a proper dinner later, Florence continued her exploration of the shop. A back room held additional inventory, and a small desk where her aunt apparently did her correspondence and bookkeeping. Florence was examining the stock list when the shop bell jangled. Assuming Martha had returned, she called out, "In the back room, Miss Blackwood." The deep voice was unmistakable. Florence emerged from the back room to find Sheriff Harrington Vaughn standing just inside the door, hat in hand. Sunlight from the window caught the copper highlights in his hair. "Sheriff," she greeted him, suddenly conscious of her simple dress and hair hastily pinned up. "What brings you here?" "Just checking to see if you're settling and all right." His eyes, bluer than she remembered, took in the shop. "And I wanted to return this." He held out a small leather-bound book. "Your aunt lent it to me before she fell ill. Never got the chance to return it." Florence accepted the volume, a collection of poetry by Tennyson. "You enjoy poetry, Sheriff?" A faint flush colored his tan cheeks. "Harriet insisted I needed to expand my reading beyond dime novels and law books." Florence couldn't help smiling at that. It sounded like something her aunt would say. And did you? Expand your reading. Some of it didn't make much sense to me, he admitted, but I liked this part. He reached over and carefully opened the book to a marked page where Ulysses was printed at the top. To strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield, Florence read aloud. Vaughn nodded. That part I understood. Their eyes met over the open book, and Florence felt a curious tightening in her chest. She broke the gaze first, closing the book and setting it on the counter. I understand there's to be a memorial service for my aunt, she said. Yes, day after tomorrow. I hope that's agreeable. He shifted his weight, seeming suddenly less sure of himself than when he faced down armed bandits. I also came to invite you to dinner. Tonight, if you're available. Florence stared at him, taken aback. Dinner at Abernathy's cafe, he clarified quickly. Thought you might appreciate someone showing you around town a bit, introducing you to folks. It was a kindness. Florence realized an attempt to ease her transition into the community. Yet the thought of walking through town with everyone watching her hobbled gait made her stomach clench. I appreciate the offer, Sheriff, but I'm quite tired from the journey. Perhaps another time. Disappointment flickered across his face before his expression returned to polite neutrality. Of course, it was presumptuous of me. Not at all, Florence assured him. It's very thoughtful. He nodded, placing his hat back on his head. If you need anything at all, my office is just down the street. Can't miss it. After he left, Florence sank onto a chair, her leg throbbing dully. She'd come to Silver Creek to escape the pity and judgment she'd faced in Boston, yet here she was, already declining invitations and hiding away. But it was different here, wasn't it? Sheriff Harrington Vaughn hadn't once mentioned her limp or looked at her with pity. Martha Abernathy had noticed her cane, but hadn't treated her any differently for it. Perhaps Silver Creek would be different after all. The memorial service for Harriet Miller was held at the small white church on the edge of town. Florence was overwhelmed by the turnout. It seemed the entire town had come to pay respects to her aunt. She sat in the front pew, acutely aware of her position as the bereaved relative, despite having been estranged from her aunt for years. People she'd never met approached to offer condolences and share stories about Harriet, how she'd extended credit to families down on their luck, how she'd special-ordered books for children with particular interests, how she'd started a reading circle for the ladies of Silver Creek. Your aunt was a remarkable woman, Reverend Patterson said to Florence after the service. She spoke of you often and with great pride. We weren't close, Florence admitted. I regret that now. She understood the circumstances, the Reverend assured her. And she never doubted you would come when the time was right. The reception following the service was held at Abernathy's cafe. Florence stood near the wall, her leg aching from standing too long, but determined not to show weakness. She nodded and smiled as people introduced themselves, trying desperately to remember names and connections. You look like you could use this, a familiar voice said, and Florence turned to find Vaughn holding out a cup of punch. Thank you, she said gratefully, accepting the drink. I'm afraid I'm terrible with names. I've already forgotten half the people I've met. Don't worry, you'll have plenty of time to learn them. He leaned against the wall beside her, casually creating a buffer between her and the next well-wisher. How are you holding up? The simple question, asked with genuine concern, nearly undid her composure. I'm fine, she said automatically, then amended. Actually, I'm overwhelmed. I had no idea Aunt Harriet meant so much to so many people. She was the heart of this town in many ways, Vaughn said. Knew everyone's business but never gossiped, offered advice but never judged. I wish I'd known her better, Florence admitted softly. Vaughn studied her for a moment. She kept all your letters, you know, had them in a box on her desk. Florence blinked back sudden tears. I only wrote a few times a year, meant the world to her, those letters. His voice was gentle. She understood why you couldn't visit. Had her aunt truly understood, or had she, like everyone else, simply pitied the niece with the ruined leg and ruined prospects? Before Florence could respond, Martha Abernathy approached, bustling through the crowd. Florence, dear, you must be exhausted. Why don't you sit down? I've saved a table for you. The suggestion was well-intentioned, but Florence bristled at the implication that she needed special accommodation. I'm quite all right, thank you. Martha exchanged a glance with Vaughn, who cleared his throat. Actually, I could use a rest myself. Been on my feet since dawn. It was an obvious ploy to make her feel less self-conscious, and Florence might have resented it from anyone else. But something about the sheriff's straightforward manner made the gesture seem like simple kindness rather than pity. In that case, she said, I wouldn't mind sitting for a moment. Martha led them to a small table in the corner, away from the bulk of the crowd. I'll bring you both some food, she promised, hurrying off. You didn't have to do that, Florence said once they were seated. Do what? Vaughn asked, his expression all innocence. Pretend you needed to rest just so I wouldn't feel embarrassed. He leaned forward, his eyes serious. Florence, in this life, we all need rest sometimes. Some of us more than others, maybe, but there's no shame in it. Easy for you to say, she replied, more sharply than intended. You don't know what it's like to have people always watching, always making allowances, always thinking of you as less than whole. Rather than being offended, Vaughn simply rolled up his left sleeve, revealing a puckered scar that ran from his wrist nearly to his elbow. Apache arrow 5 years ago, went clean through. Doctor said I might lose the arm, and if not, I'd never have full use of it again. Florence stared at the scar, then at his apparently functional arm. But you recovered. Mostly, he agreed, rolling his sleeve back down. Still can't straighten it completely. Aches something fierce before it rains. Point is, we've all got our scars, Florence. Some are just more visible than others. Before she could respond, Martha returned with plates of food, and the conversation turned to lighter topics. Vaughn pointed out various townspeople, giving Florence brief, often humorous introductions. That's Franklin Morris, owns the Mercantile. Fair prices, but he'll talk your ear off about his prize chickens if you let him. The woman in the blue dress is Widow Jenkins. Best seamstress in 3 counties, but she's nearly blind as a bat now. Still does beautiful work, though. The tall fellow by the door is Doc Wilson. Good physician, terrible poker player. Never believe him when he says he's got a good hand. Florence found herself laughing more than she had in years. Vaughn had a gift for storytelling, painting vivid pictures of the townspeople with just a few words. As the afternoon wore on, people began to drift away. Florence realized with surprise that her leg had stopped aching, or perhaps she'd simply been too engaged in conversation to notice it. I should get back to the shop, she said finally. I want to start organizing things properly tomorrow. Vaughn stood immediately. I'll walk you back. The spring afternoon was pleasant, with a light breeze carrying the scent of blooming desert flowers. Florence walked carefully, conscious of the uneven boardwalk, but found herself less concerned with who might be watching her awkward gait. Thank you for your company today, she said as they reached the bookshop. You made a difficult day much easier. Vaughn removed his hat, turning it in his hands. I was hoping you might reconsider my dinner invitation. For tomorrow night, perhaps, Florence hesitated. Part of her, the part that had been hurt and humiliated in Boston, wanted to refuse, to protect herself from further pain. But another part, a part that had been dormant for too long, wanted to accept. I would like that, she said finally. His smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. I'll call for you at 6, then. As she watched him walk away, Florence felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time, a flutter of anticipation, a sense of possibility. The next day, Florence threw herself into organizing the bookshop. Her aunt's system, once she understood it, was logical but needed updating. She spent hours cataloging inventory, dusting shelves, and rearranging displays. By mid-afternoon, she was satisfied enough with her progress to place an open sign in the window. Within minutes, her first customer arrived, a young girl of about 12 with dark braids and serious eyes. Are you Miss Harriet's niece? The girl asked, studying Florence with unconcealed curiosity. I am. My name is Florence Blackwood. The girl nodded as if confirming something to herself. I'm Lily Wilson, Doc Wilson's daughter. Miss Harriet was ordering a book for me before she got sick. Let me check her records, Florence said, moving to the desk where her aunt kept notes of special orders. Sure enough, there was an entry for L. Wilson Illustrated Natural History Vol. 2. It appears the book was ordered but hasn't arrived yet, Florence told her. I'll make inquiries about it. Lily's face fell slightly. Oh, I was hoping it might have come. Are you particularly interested in natural history? Florence asked. The girl's expression brightened. Yes. I want to be a doctor like my father, but he says I should study all sciences. The first volume had the most fascinating illustrations of insects and small creatures. Florence thought for a moment, then moved to a shelf near the back. While you're waiting for your order, you might enjoy this. She pulled down a slim volume. It's about the flora and fauna specific to this territory. Lily took the book reverently, opening it to reveal detailed drawings of desert plants and animals. This is wonderful. How much is it? Consider it a loan, Florence said. You can return it when your order arrives. The girl's face lit up. Really, thank you, Miss Blackwood. After Lily left, clutching her borrowed book, Florence had a steady stream of visitors, some genuinely interested in purchasing books, others merely curious about Harriet Miller's niece from Boston. By the time she closed the shop at 5 o'clock, Florence was exhausted but satisfied. She'd made several sales, taken 3 special orders, and begun to put faces to the names Vaughn had mentioned the day before. Upstairs, she faced a new dilemma: what to wear for dinner. She'd brought a limited wardrobe, most of it practical rather than fashionable. Finally, she settled on a deep blue dress with a modest neckline and elbow-length sleeves. It wasn't the height of fashion, but the color complemented her fair complexion and auburn hair. At precisely 6 o'clock, there was a knock at the shop door. Florence made her way downstairs, taking care on the steep steps, and opened the door to find Vaughn standing there. He'd exchanged his usual work clothes for a clean white shirt, dark vest, and string tie. His hair was neatly combed, and he'd clearly shaved recently. Good evening, Florence, he said, his eyes taking in her appearance with evident appreciation. You look lovely. Thank you, she replied, feeling a blush rise to her cheeks. You look quite handsome yourself. He offered his arm. Shall we? Florence hesitated only briefly before placing her hand in the crook of his elbow. With her cane in her other hand, they made their way slowly down the street toward the cafe. I hear you opened the shop today, Vaughn remarked. News travels fast in Silver Creek, Florence observed. He chuckled. Lily Wilson told her father, who mentioned it to me when I stopped by to check on a prisoner with a toothache. She's a bright girl, Florence said. Reminds me a bit of myself at that age, always with my nose in a book. Doc says she's smarter than he is already. He's hoping she'll take over his practice someday. Florence looked at him in surprise. But she's a girl. So was the first doctor I ever knew, Vaughn said matter-of-factly. Woman named Rebecca Johnson patched me up after my first gunfight, steadiest hands I've ever seen. The casual acceptance in his voice, the lack of any indication that a female doctor was unusual or inappropriate, struck Florence deeply. In Boston, even her modest ambition to teach had been considered suspect by some. The cafe was busy when they arrived, but Martha had reserved a table for them near the window. The other diners looked up with interest as Vaughn escorted Florence to her seat, but there was nothing malicious in their gazes, just the natural curiosity of a small town. Special tonight is beef stew, Martha announced as she approached their table. Made it fresh this afternoon. Sounds perfect, Vaughn said, looking to Florence for confirmation. She nodded agreement, and Martha bustled off to place their order. I understand you had a successful first day at the shop, Vaughn said once they were alone. It went better than I expected, Florence admitted. Everyone was very welcoming. People here respected your aunt. They're inclined to extend that respect to you. He paused, then added, though you'll earn it in your own right soon enough. The simple confidence in his statement warmed her. You barely know me, Sheriff. How can you be so sure? I'm a good judge of character, he replied, his eyes holding hers. Comes with the job. Their dinner arrived, along with fresh bread and a bottle of wine that Vaughn insisted on paying for despite Florence's protests. The stew was delicious, rich and hearty, with tender beef and vegetables from Martha's garden. As they ate, Vaughn told Florence more about Silver Creek, its history as a mining town, the recent efforts to bring in more families and businesses, the challenges of maintaining law and order in a growing community. It sounds as though you care deeply about this place, Florence observed. I do, he acknowledged. Wasn't born here, came for the silver rush like most folks, but it became home. He looked at her curiously. Do you think you could come to feel that way about Silver Creek? The question caught her off guard. I don't know, she answered honestly. I've only just arrived. Of course, he said quickly. It was a foolish question. Not foolish, she corrected. Just premature. I need time to settle in to see if the bookshop can support me. And if it can't, Florence hadn't allowed herself to consider that possibility. I suppose I would have to sell and return to Boston. The thought filled her with unexpected dread. Going back would mean admitting defeat, facing those who had written her off as an invalid, as damaged goods. The shop will succeed, Vaughn said firmly. Your aunt built a loyal customer base, and you've already shown you know how to maintain it. His confidence was flattering but puzzling. Why does it matter to you whether I stay or go? The directness of her question seemed to catch him off guard. He looked down at his plate, then back up at her, his expression more vulnerable than she'd seen it. Because Silver Creek would be a poorer place without you in it, he said simply. The honesty in his voice made Florence's heart beat faster. No man had spoken to her with such sincerity since before her accident, certainly not Edmund, who had been full of pretty phrases that ultimately meant nothing. Before she could formulate a response, the cafe door burst open, and a young cowboy rushed in. Sheriff. There's trouble at the Silver Dollar. Johnson and Emmett are going at it again, and Johnson's got a gun this time. Vaughn was on his feet instantly, all traces of the gentle dinner companion replaced by the lawman. Excuse me, Florence, duty calls. Of course, she said, trying to hide her disappointment. He hesitated, then quickly bent and pressed a kiss to her cheek. I'll make this up to you, he promised before hurrying out after the messenger. Florence sat stunned, her hand rising to touch the spot where his lips had brushed her skin. Around her, the cafe returned to its normal hum of conversation, though she caught several curious glances in her direction. Martha appeared at her elbow. Don't you worry, dear. The sheriff deals with those troublemakers at the saloon every Saturday night. He'll be back before you know it. But he didn't return, and eventually Florence had to accept that their evening had been cut short. Martha insisted on escorting her back to the bookshop, chatting all the way about how the sheriff had never been seen taking a lady to dinner before, and wasn't that interesting. At her door, Florence thanked Martha for the meal and the company. It's nothing, dear, Martha assured her. We're just glad to see the sheriff taking an interest in someone. He's been alone too long. Florence lay awake that night, replaying the dinner in her mind. Vaughn's attentiveness, his unexpected kiss, the way his eyes had held hers across the table, it all suggested an interest beyond mere neighborly welcome. But could a man like him truly be attracted to a woman with her limitations? And even if he was, could she trust such feelings? She'd believed Edmund loved her too, until the accident had revealed the conditional nature of that love. The next morning, Florence was arranging a new display in the shop window when she noticed a commotion on the street. A wagon had overturned, spilling crates and barrels across the road. The driver, an older man, was shouting and gesticulating wildly. Curious, Florence stepped outside. From her vantage point on the boardwalk, she could see that one of the wagon wheels had completely separated from the axle. Whole shipment ruined. The driver was exclaiming to anyone who would listen. 3 days on the trail, and now this. Several townspeople had gathered to help, among them Vaughn. He was directing the effort to right the wagon and salvage what cargo they could. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, revealing sun-bronzed forearms as he lifted a heavy crate. As if sensing her gaze, he looked up and caught sight of her. Even from a distance, his smile was unmistakable. He said something to the men helping him, then made his way through the crowd toward her. Good morning, he said, removing his hat as he approached. I'm sorry about last night. There's no need to apologize, Florence assured him. I understand you have responsibilities. Still, it wasn't how I wanted our evening to end. His eyes held a warmth that made her breath catch. I was hoping you might allow me to make it up to you, perhaps a picnic tomorrow. There's a pretty spot by the creek that gives the town its name. A picnic would mean walking some distance, possibly over rough terrain. Florence hesitated, her hand tightening on her cane. Vaughn noticed her hesitation and added quickly, We can take my buggy. The trail's passable for it most of the way. The thoughtfulness of the offer made without drawing attention to her disability touched Florence deeply. "I would like that very much." "Excellent. I'll call for you around noon if that suits," Florence nodded, smiling. "Noon is perfect." He returned to help with the overturned wagon, and Florence went back into the shop, her heart lighter than it had been in years. The rest of the day passed in a pleasant blur. Florence served customers, organized books, and began planning changes to make the shop more accessible for herself. By closing time, she had a list of improvements. She wanted to make a stool behind the counter to rest on when her leg ached, a rearrangement of the shelves to reduce the need for climbing the library ladder, a bell on the door so she could work in the back room without missing customers. Sunday morning dawned clear and warm. Florence dressed carefully in a light green skirt and white shirtwaist, with a matching green ribbon for her hair. She packed a few items to contribute to the picnic: some apples she'd purchased from a vendor the day before, and cookies Martha had sent over. At noon precisely, a buggy pulled up in front of the shop. Vaughn jumped down, looking handsome in clean denims and a fresh shirt, his hair still damp from washing. "Right on time," Florence said as she opened the door. "My mother always said punctuality was a virtue," he replied, taking the small basket from her hands. "Is this all you're bringing? Just a few additions to whatever you've planned," she said. "I hope that's all right. More than all right." He offered his arm to help her down the steps and to the buggy. "I'm afraid I'm not much of a cook, so my contributions are simple." The buggy was well sprung, making the ride comfortable even over the rutted trail that led out of town. Florence held onto her hat with one hand as they bounced along, laughing when a particularly large bump nearly unseated her. "Sorry about that," Vaughn said, steadying her with a hand on her arm. "Road gets better up ahead." True to his word, the trail smoothed out as they followed the creek upstream. The water gurgled merrily beside them, catching sunlight and throwing it back in diamond bright flashes. After about 20 minutes, Vaughn guided the buggy into a small clearing shaded by cottonwood trees. The creek widened here into a shallow pool, its waters clear enough to see the stones beneath. "It's beautiful," Florence said, taking in the peaceful scene. Vaughn jumped down and came around to help her descend. His hands at her waist were strong and sure as he lifted her down, lingering perhaps a moment longer than strictly necessary. From the back of the buggy, he produced a blanket and a large basket. "Found a spot out of the sun?" he asked. Florence pointed to a grassy area beneath the largest cottonwood. "That looks perfect." Together they spread the blanket and unpacked their food: cold chicken, bread and cheese, the apples and cookies Florence had brought, and a bottle of cider. "This is quite a feast," Florence remarked as they settled on the blanket. "Nothing fancy," Vaughn said, looking slightly embarrassed. "Martha helped with the chicken. It looks wonderful." Florence accepted the plate he offered her. "Thank you for suggesting this. It's been a long time since I've been on a picnic." "No picnics in Boston?" he asked, pouring cider into tin cups. "Not recently," she admitted. "After my accident I didn't get out much." Vaughn's expression grew serious. "May I ask what happened? You don't have to tell me if you'd rather not." Florence considered deflecting the question, as she usually did, but something about the setting, the open sky, the burbling creek, Vaughn's attentive presence made her want to share the truth. "It was 2 years ago," she began. "I was crossing a street in Boston when a carriage horse spooked. The driver lost control and the carriage, well, it ran over my right leg." She gestured toward the limb in question. "The doctors said I was lucky not to lose it entirely." Vaughn's face had darkened. "And the driver was cleared of any wrongdoing," Florence said. "It truly was an accident." "Still," he muttered, "a man should be more careful with his team in a crowded street." The protectiveness in his voice warmed her. "It's in the past now." "Is that why you came west, to make a fresh start?" Florence nodded. "Partly. Boston holds difficult memories now." She didn't mention Edmund, or the friends who had drifted away, or the invitations that had ceased coming. "And are you finding what you hoped for here?" Vaughn asked, his eyes intent on hers. "I think I might be," she said softly. They ate in companionable silence for a while, listening to the creek and the birdsong overhead. When they'd finished, Vaughn gathered the remains of their meal back into the basket. "Would you like to sit by the water?" he asked. "It's shallow enough to dangle your feet if you'd like to cool off." The idea was tempting, but Florence hesitated. "I'm not sure I can manage the bank." "I can help you," he offered, then added with a smile, "if you'll allow it." There was something in his manner, a respect for her independence combined with a genuine desire to assist that made it impossible to refuse. "All right," she agreed. Vaughn extended his hand, and she took it, allowing him to support her as they made their way to the creek's edge. The bank was indeed steep, but with his help, Florence was able to settle on a flat rock at the water's edge. "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward her boots. Florence nodded, her throat suddenly dry. With gentle hands, Vaughn unlaced first one boot, then the other, setting them aside. He rolled up the hem of her skirt just enough to keep it dry, his fingers briefly brushing against her ankle in a touch that sent a shiver through her. "The water's cool, but not too cold," he said, removing his own boots and rolling up his trouser legs. Together they slipped their feet into the creek. The water was indeed pleasantly cool, flowing around their ankles in a gentle current. Small fish darted between the stones, occasionally nibbling curiously at their toes. "Oh," Florence exclaimed at the ticklish sensation. "They're quite bold, aren't they?" Vaughn laughed. "Creek minnows, fearless little creatures." They sat side by side, feet in the water, shoulders nearly touching. The afternoon sun filtered through the cottonwood leaves, casting dappled shadows across the ground and water. "I used to come here when I first became sheriff," Vaughn said after a while. "When the job seemed too big or the decisions too hard, this place helped clear my head." "It's very peaceful," Florence agreed. "I can see why you'd seek it out." "I've never brought anyone else here before," he admitted, his voice low. Florence turned to look at him, surprised by the confession. "Never," he shook his head. "Never felt right before." The implication hung in the air between them that she was different, special in some way. Florence's heart raced, but doubt crept in as well. What if he was merely being kind to the crippled newcomer? What if his interest was born of pity rather than genuine attraction? As if reading her thoughts, Vaughn reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers entwining with hers. "Florence, I know we haven't known each other long, but I want you to know that a gunshot echoed in the distance, cutting him off." Vaughn was instantly alert, his posture tensing as he scanned the surroundings. "That came from the direction of town," he said, standing quickly and helping Florence to her feet. More shots followed, a rapid succession that suggested a serious confrontation rather than an accident or casual target practice. "We need to get back," Vaughn said grimly, helping Florence with her boots. "Something's wrong." They hurried to the buggy, leaving their picnic things behind. Vaughn lifted Florence onto the seat and took up the reins, urging the horse to a pace that had them bouncing uncomfortably on the rutted trail. As they approached Silver Creek, they could see a plume of smoke rising from the south end of town. People were running in the streets, and more gunshots could be heard. "Raiders," Vaughn said tersely. "Probably the Jackson gang. They've hit settlements up and down the territory." He pulled the buggy to a stop in front of the bookshop. "Stay here," he ordered, reaching under the seat to retrieve a rifle. "Lock the doors and don't open them for anyone but me." "Vaughn, be careful," Florence pleaded, clutching his arm. He looked at her, his expression softening briefly. "I will. Now go inside, quickly." Florence did as he asked, watching from the window as he rode toward the commotion, rifle in hand. From her vantage point, she could see several riders galloping through town, firing indiscriminately. One of the buildings, the assayer's office, she thought was clearly on fire. Heart pounding, Florence moved away from the window as a rider passed nearby. She locked the front and back doors, then went upstairs where she could observe without being seen. From the upstairs window, she had a clearer view of the chaos. Vaughn had gathered several armed townsmen and was organizing a defense. They took positions behind buildings and wagons, returning fire when the raiders passed. Florence saw one raider fall from his horse, then another. The battle seemed to last forever, though in reality it couldn't have been more than 20 minutes. Finally, the remaining raiders retreated, galloping out of town the way they had come. Florence waited anxiously, watching as people emerged from buildings to assess the damage. She saw Doc Wilson hurrying toward the wounded, and Martha Abernathy organizing a bucket line to fight the fire at the assayer's office. Then she spotted Vaughn, still mounted, directing the townspeople. He appeared unharmed, and relief flooded through her. When he turned his horse toward the bookshop, Florence hurried downstairs to meet him. She opened the door at his knock, flinging her arms around him before she could think better of it. "You're all right." His arms closed around her, holding her tightly for a moment before he set her gently back. "I'm fine, are you?" "Yes, I stayed inside as you asked." She looked up at him anxiously. "What happened?" "Jackson gang like I thought," he confirmed. "They've been raiding towns all through the territory, tried to rob the assayer's office, but Mr. Peterson put up a fight." "Is he wounded, but Doc thinks he'll pull through?" Vaughn ran a hand through his hair, which was dusty and disheveled. "We lost 2 men, Frank Morris from the Mercantile and one of the miners, Joe Blackburn." "I'm so sorry," Florence said, thinking of the storekeeper who had sold her supplies just the day before. "We drove them off, but they'll likely regroup and hit another town." Vaughn's expression was grim. "I need to organize a posse to go after them before they can. Now." "But you've just fought them off. That's when they're vulnerable, when they're running, possibly wounded." He took her hands in his. "I have to go, Florence. It's my job." She wanted to protest, to beg him to stay, but she knew it would be futile. This was who he was, a man who put duty above personal comfort, who protected others even at risk to himself. It was part of what drew her to him. "When will you leave?" she asked instead. "As soon as we can gather men and supplies, an hour, maybe less." He squeezed her hands. "I'm sorry about our picnic." "Don't be ridiculous," she said, forcing a smile. "Go do what you need to do, just come back safely." His eyes held hers for a long moment. Then, as if making a decision, he bent and kissed her, not on the cheek this time, but squarely on the lips. It was brief but unmistakably passionate, leaving her breathless when he pulled away. "I will," he promised, then turned and strode back toward the center of town, where men were already gathering with horses and weapons. Florence touched her fingers to her lips, still feeling the pressure of his kiss. Only then did she realize she hadn't once thought about her limp or her cane during their entire exchange. The next few days were the longest of Florence's life. The posse, led by Vaughn, had ridden out shortly after the raid, leaving the town anxious and on edge. Florence threw herself into helping with the recovery efforts, organizing donations for Frank Morris's widow, reading to the wounded men in Doc Wilson's makeshift hospital, and keeping the bookshop open as a place where people could gather and share news. "You're a godsend," Martha told her on the 3rd day, as Florence poured coffee for a group of women who had come to sew bandages. "Stepping up like this when you've only just arrived." "It's the least I can do," Florence said. "Everyone has been so welcoming to me." The truth was, keeping busy helped her manage her worry about Vaughn. Each day without news stretched her nerves tighter. What if he'd been ambushed? What if he was lying wounded somewhere in the wilderness beyond help? On the morning of the 4th day, Florence was arranging a display of adventure novels when the shop door flew open. Lily Wilson stood there, breathless from running. "They're back," she exclaimed. "The posse is coming into town right now." Florence's heart leaped. "Sheriff Harrington." "Is he with them?" "Yes, madam. Pa says he's bringing in the whole Jackson gang." Abandoning the display, Florence grabbed her cane and hurried outside. A crowd had gathered at the end of Main Street, where riders were indeed approaching, dusty, weary men escorting several bound prisoners. At the head of the group rode Vaughn, his face sunburned and stubbled with several days' growth of beard, but wonderfully, beautifully alive. Their eyes met across the distance, and he smiled, a tired smile, but one that reached his eyes. Florence stood with the other townspeople, watching as the prisoners were led to the jail. Only when that task was complete did Vaughn make his way through the crowd toward her. "You came back," she said, unable to keep the relief from her voice. "I promised I would." He looked down at her, his eyes soft despite his obvious exhaustion. "And I had a powerful reason to keep that promise." Before she could respond, he was surrounded by well-wishers, all eager to hear the story of the posse's success. Florence stepped back, content to wait her turn, to know that he was safe and had sought her out first among all the crowd. Later that evening, after Vaughn had rested and cleaned up, he came to the bookshop. Florence had closed early, anticipating his visit, and was waiting with a simple dinner she'd prepared upstairs. "You didn't have to cook," he protested when she invited him up. "You must be tired from all you've been doing for the town." "I wanted to," she said simply. "Besides, you're the one who's been chasing outlaws for days. You must be starving for a home-cooked meal." They ate at the small table in her kitchen, Vaughn recounting the pursuit and eventual capture of the Jackson gang. "We tracked them into the mountains where they thought they could lose us. But Tom White, the blacksmith, he was a scout during the war, best tracker I've ever seen." "Were there casualties?" Florence asked, noting the bandage peeking from beneath his sleeve. "Just this," he said, touching the bandage. "Bullet grazed me during the final confrontation. Doc Wilson patched it up before I came here." "I was so worried," Florence admitted, the words escaping before she could stop them. Vaughn reached across the table to take her hand. "I thought about you every day I was gone, about what I didn't get to say at the creek before the raiders came." Florence's heart quickened. "What was that?" "That I'm falling in love with you, Florence Blackwood." His voice was steady, his eyes unwavering as they held hers. "I know it's too soon, maybe, but I've never been one to waste time when I'm certain of something." Florence stared at him, unable to believe what she was hearing. "Vaughn, you can't possibly—" "I can," he interrupted gently, "and I do. But my leg, my limp, what about them?" he asked, genuinely puzzled. "Most men wouldn't want a wife who can't. I'm not most men," he said firmly. "And I didn't say anything about a wife." A smile tugged at his lips. "Not yet, anyway." Florence felt tears gathering in her eyes. "The last man who claimed to love me couldn't bear the thought of spending his life with a cripple." Anger flashed across Vaughn's face. "Then he was a fool who never deserved you in the first place." He rose from his chair and came around the table, kneeling beside her despite his wounded arm. "Florence, I don't care about your limp. I care about your courage, your kindness, your quick mind and generous heart." He took both her hands in his. "In fact, the only thing I like about that limp is that it makes you walk right into my arms where I hope you'll stay." A tear slipped down Florence's cheek. "You really mean that, don't you? Every word." He reached up to brush the tear away. "I'm not asking for promises right now. Just a chance to court you properly, to show you that what I feel is real and lasting." Florence looked into his eyes and saw nothing but sincerity and affection. In that moment, the walls she'd built around her heart since the accident began to crumble. "I think I'd like that," she whispered. His smile was like sunshine breaking through clouds. Slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, he leaned forward and kissed her. Unlike the hurried kiss before he'd left with the posse, this was gentle and unhurried, a promise rather than a farewell. When they finally parted, Florence felt as though something fundamental had shifted inside her. For the first time since the accident, she wasn't thinking of herself as damaged or less than. In Vaughn's eyes, she was simply Florence, whole and worthy of love. Over the weeks that followed, Vaughn courted Florence with a dedication that charmed the entire town. He brought her wildflowers picked from the hillsides, borrowed poetry books from her shop to read aloud to her in the evenings, and escorted her to every social event in Silver Creek. For her part, Florence blossomed under his attention. She grew more confident in her place in the community, expanding the bookshop's offerings and starting a weekly reading circle for children. Her limp was still there, but it ceased to define her in her own mind or, it seemed, in anyone else's. One evening in late summer, Vaughn took her back to their spot by the creek. The cottonwoods were beginning to turn golden, a few early leaves drifting down to float on the water's surface. They sat side by side on the blanket he'd spread, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Florence leaned against his shoulder, content in a way she'd never thought possible again after her accident. "I've been thinking," Vaughn said, his voice a comfortable rumble against her ear. "A dangerous pastime," she teased. He chuckled. "Perhaps, but I've been thinking that Silver Creek is growing and a growing town needs a proper school." "It does have a school," Florence pointed out. "A one-room schoolhouse with 30 children and a teacher who's ready to retire," Vaughn corrected. "What it needs is a proper school with more than one teacher." Florence sat up, looking at him curiously. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I've spoken to the town council," he said, "and they agree." They're planning to build a new school by next spring, and they'll need at least 2 teachers. Understanding dawned. And you think I should apply for one of those positions? I think you'd be perfect for it, he confirmed. The way you work with the children at your reading circle, the patience you show. You were born to teach, Florence. She considered the idea. Teaching had been her dream before the accident, a dream she'd abandoned when Edmund and others had convinced her that no parents would want a crippled woman teaching their children. "Do you really think the town would accept me as a teacher?" she asked, the old doubts surfacing. Vaughn took her face in his hands, his expression serious. "Florence, this town already accepts you not in spite of your limp, but simply because of who you are. Haven't you noticed that no one here treats you as an invalid, that no one stares or whispers?" It was true, she realized. Since coming to Silver Creek, she'd gradually stopped hiding her leg, stopped avoiding situations where she might have to walk in front of others. And no one had ever made her feel less for it. "Besides," Vaughn continued, "I have a selfish reason for wanting you to take the teaching position." "Oh, and what's that?" He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small box. "If you were a teacher, you'd need a place to live, and I happen to know a sheriff who's building a house at the edge of town, a house that's going to be much too big for just one person." Florence's breath caught as he opened the box to reveal a delicate silver band set with a small but perfect diamond. "Florence Blackwood," Vaughn said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "I love you more than I ever thought possible. Would you do me the incredible honor of becoming my wife?" Tears blurred her vision as she looked from the ring to his beloved face. All the doubts and fears that had haunted her since the accident seemed to fall away, leaving only the certainty that this man, this wonderful, patient, accepting man, truly loved her for exactly who she was. "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "Yes, Vaughn Harrington, I will marry you." His smile was radiant as he slipped the ring onto her finger. Then he gathered her into his arms, kissing her with a passion that left no doubt of his feelings. When they finally broke apart, breathless and laughing, Florence rested her forehead against his. "I love you," she said, the words coming easily now. "I love you, and I'm not afraid anymore." "Afraid of what?" he asked, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Of the future, of being seen, of being loved." She smiled up at him. "You've given me back parts of myself I thought were lost forever." "You did that yourself," he corrected gently. "I just had the good sense to recognize an extraordinary woman when I met one." They were married in the white church on a crisp October day with the entire town in attendance. Florence wore a gown of ivory silk that Martha and the other women had helped her make, with a modest train that cleverly disguised her uneven gait as she walked down the aisle on Doc Wilson's arm. Vaughn waited at the altar, his expression a mixture of pride and awe as he watched his bride approach. When Doc placed Florence's hand in his, Vaughn squeezed it gently, a silent message of love and support. "Dearly beloved," began Reverend Patterson, "we are gathered here today." The ceremony was simple but heartfelt. When it came time for the vows, Vaughn spoke in a clear, steady voice that carried to the back of the church. "I, Vaughn James Harrington, take you, Florence Elizabeth Blackwood, to be my lawfully wedded wife. I promise to love and cherish you, in sickness and in health, in good times and bad, for all the days of my life." Florence's voice trembled slightly as she repeated her own vows, overcome with emotion at the journey that had brought her to this moment. "I, Florence Elizabeth Blackwood, take you, Vaughn James Harrington, to be my lawfully wedded husband. I promise to love and cherish you in sickness and in health, in good times and bad, for all the days of my life. By the power vested in me," Reverend Patterson concluded, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride." Vaughn's kiss was tender and reverent, a promise sealed before God and their community, when they turned to face the congregation as Mr. and Mrs. Harrington. The cheers and applause were deafening. The celebration that followed lasted well into the night, with food and dancing and more goodwill than Florence had ever experienced. She danced with her husband despite her limp, his strong arms supporting her as they swayed to the fiddle music. "Happy?" he asked, his lips close to her ear. "More than I ever dreamed possible," she replied truthfully. The house Vaughn had built for them stood on a gentle rise at the edge of town with a view of both the mountains and the creek. It was larger than Florence had expected: 4 bedrooms, a spacious kitchen, and a front porch that wrapped around 2 sides of the house. "Why so many bedrooms?" she asked as he carried her over the threshold that night. "One for us," he said, setting her down carefully in the front hallway. "One for my office and 2." He smiled, a hint of shyness in his expression. "2 for the children I hope we'll have." Florence's heart swelled with love for this man who believed in their future so completely. "I hope so too," she whispered, drawing his head down for a kiss. 5 years later, Florence stood on that same front porch, watching as Vaughn rode up the path toward home. Behind her, the sounds of children playing filtered through the open door, 4-year-old James chasing his 2-year-old sister Victoria around the kitchen table, supervised by Martha Abernathy, who had become a surrogate grandmother to the Harrington children. As Vaughn dismounted and tied his horse to the hitching post, Florence felt the familiar rush of love and gratitude that had become a constant in her life. Her husband was a good man, fair and just as a sheriff, tender and devoted as a husband and father. Daddy's home. James shouted, spotting his father through the window and racing outside, Victoria toddling after him as fast as her little legs could carry her. Vaughn scooped both children up, one in each arm, covering their faces with kisses as they giggled and squirmed. Then he looked up at Florence, his smile widening. "And how's my beautiful wife today?" he asked, climbing the porch steps with the children still in his arms. "Waiting for you," she replied, reaching up to straighten his slightly askew hat. "As always." He leaned down to kiss her, a gesture that had lost none of its sweetness over the years. "Sorry I'm late. Town council meeting ran long. They're finally deciding on that expansion for the school." Florence nodded. The small school where she taught 3 days a week had grown along with the town. "It's about time. We've been crowded for months." Vaughn set the children down and they raced back inside, eager to show Martha their latest drawings. He took advantage of the moment alone to pull Florence into a proper embrace. "I missed you today," he murmured against her hair. "You were only gone since morning," she laughed, though she'd missed him too long, he insisted, pulling back to look at her. His expression grew serious. "I heard from the doctor in Denver." Florence's heart skipped a beat. They'd consulted the specialist during a rare trip to the city the previous month, seeking his opinion on whether surgery might improve the function of her damaged leg. "What did he say?" she asked, hardly daring to hope. "He thinks the new procedure could help," Vaughn said cautiously. "Not a complete cure, but possibly less pain, more mobility." Florence considered this. The operation would be expensive and risky with no guarantee of success, yet the prospect of walking more easily, of being able to keep up with her growing children. "We should think about it," she said. "Discuss it properly when the children are asleep." Vaughn nodded, understanding as always. "Whatever you decide, Florence, I'm with you. You know that." "I do know that," she said, touching his cheek gently. "It's why I can face anything, because I have you beside me." He turned his head to kiss her palm. "Always." They stood together on the porch as the sun began to set, painting the sky in the same colors as on the day he'd proposed. So much had changed since Florence had first arrived in Silver Creek, ashamed of her limp and afraid of her future. Now she had a husband who loved her completely, children who saw nothing strange in their mother's uneven gait, and a community that valued her for her contributions rather than judging her for her limitations. "What are you thinking about?" Vaughn asked, his arm warm around her waist. Florence smiled up at him, her heart full. "I was thinking about what you said the day we met when I stumbled getting off the stagecoach." "What did I say?" he asked, genuinely not remembering. "You said there's no shame in accepting help when it's offered freely." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "You were right, though I didn't fully understand it then." Vaughn kissed the top of her head. "You've given as much help as you've received, Florence. This town is better because you're in it." From inside came the sound of Victoria crying, followed by James's defensive, "I didn't do it," and Martha's soothing voice trying to mediate. Florence laughed. "We should go in before they drive poor Martha to distraction." "In a minute," Vaughn said, turning her to face him. "I just want to look at you a moment longer." His eyes, still as blue and direct as the day they'd met, held the same warmth and admiration they always had when he looked at her. In them, Florence saw not the damaged woman she'd once believed herself to be, but the person she truly was: strong, capable, and deeply loved. "I love you, Vaughn Harrington," she said simply. "And I love you, Florence Harrington," he replied, limp and all. Hand in hand, they went inside to their children, to the life they'd built together in Silver Creek, a life neither of them could have imagined on that dusty day when a stagecoach robbery brought them together. And a sheriff told a wounded woman that her limp only made her walk right into his arms.